Hinge game is just one of those creaky games that, depending on which way it swings in the season, will have a big impact. And we got to find out which way they're going to swing. And I got 5 of these games, but this is not an exhaustive list, so I'm happy to take feedback from you. We don't normally have hinge games in week 1 because no one knows anything in week 1. But week 1 has a massive hinge game this year. Unique circumstances. Miami goes to Gainesville in week 1. They go to Florida. Miami at Florida in week 1. And we've got a line on this game. FanDuel, sure enough, has a line on the game. If you haven't seen it, what do you think it is? Before I show it to you, before I say it, Miami at Florida. This game's in the swamp at 3:30. It's a if they die, they die special. Probably 107 degrees before you factor in heat index. Who do you think is favored? The answer is Miami, -2.5 at FanDuel. You can bet that right now. Ironically, unless you're in the state of Florida. But do we think that number's going to stay there? I don't know, and it's not Friday Night Lines right now, which is one of many reasons you should follow on Instagram at LateKickJosh. Oh, Friday Night Lines, how great is that going to be this fall? But this is about hinge games. Do you understand how toxic things are going to get for the loser of this game? Way too toxic. Way too toxic. Because it's one game. It's an out-of-conference game. Everyone's hopes and dreams are still in front of them, no matter if they win or lose this game. Candidly, personally, I think this game is not a must-win. It's more of a must-win for Florida than Miami, in my opinion, and I'll talk about that in August. But be that as it may, if Miami loses, Mario's just going to hear a whole lot of the same thing. You can go get the players, but you can't win with them. If Florida loses, it's going to be, well, first of many, bowl season out the window for us this year. Fire Billy. Blue chip Billy? No. Sunbelt Billy. It's going to be gross, toxic. Luckily, I'm not either one of those guys, so I don't have to worry about it personally, but it's going to be a hinge game. An unprecedented hinge game in week 1 nonetheless, but it's going to be a hinge game. Now I go to week 9, which is where far more often than not the hinge games are, the middle to latter portion of the season. Week 9. You know who plays in the Big Ten in week 9? Nebraska at Ohio State. Now, Nebraska's over-under win total is 7.5. Nebraska may be favored in all 8 games before they play this one in week 9. And I don't think many people realize that. Favored doesn't mean a whole lot, especially given Nebraska's recent history in one-possession games. I understand if you want to make that point. However, statistically, that's got to turn over sometime. So I'm going to read this to you right quick if you're listening on pod. UTEP, Colorado, Northern Iowa, Illinois. That's a Friday game against Illinois. At Purdue, Rutgers, at Indiana. That's the first 8 games before they go to Ohio State. Now, they go to Ohio State, they'll be a sizable underdog, even if they're undefeated. And even if Ohio State's already lost, like to Oregon, they'll be a double-digit underdog, I believe. But here's the thing. What if they pulled that out? Or what if they just played them close? I'm a believer that in a season like this, Nebraska can lose that game and win. They can't lose it 52-3 and win. But if they lose it 35-31, they go in there and go toe-to-toe with Ryan Day and Ohio State, who will settle for nothing less than a national title this year. Nebraska as a program is kind of sort of off to the races. Oh, and by the way, if they were good enough to hang close with Ohio State that day, probably means they're good enough to challenge for a spot in the Big Ten championship game. Even if they're not, even if they're just a good, solid 8-win team this year, that's really good sign. Because it also means they rode a true freshman quarterback in the process of doing that. So that's a big hinge game. Because also Ohio State will have already faced Oregon, and they'll still have a trip to Penn State and a home game against Michigan to round out the season. So that's certainly not an affordable slip-up spot for Ohio State, whether they're undefeated or not. So I think Nebraska at Ohio State, one of the bigger hinge games in the Big Ten this year. Back to the ACC for an actual conference game. This one's easy to see coming. Clemson at Florida State, week 6. Huge hinge game. It's not a division game anymore because we don't have divisions. So they could play again. So it's not a knockout game. And that's a good thing. We like that. That's a good move by the ACC. This is a chance for a trend reversal for Clemson because the trend has been Florida State on the way up, Clemson on the way down. One of them uses the portal constantly. The other one can't even speak the word portal without having to wash their mouth out with soap. Well, here's the thing about that. As long as you play, we get to find out. We get a referendum. Florida State won this thing last year. If they win it again, then the chorus only intensifies. Dabo, you got to change your ways. Mike, you got it figured out. Keep rolling. Keep doing what you're doing, buddy. But if they go down there, if they go into Doak, if Clemson goes into Tallahassee and they win, probably as a point spread underdog, then Dabo gets to go to the podium. Not only does he get to do that grin that Dabo does when they win, and we've seen a lot of it over the years. Sometimes I enjoy it, sometimes I don't, depending on if I picked him or not. He gets to go to the podium, and he would never say this. He's far too classy to say it. But imagine if Clemson won the game in Tallahassee, and Dabo goes to the podium and says, wow, not only did we beat Florida State's recruits, we beat all those transfer players. And, we may not use the portal a whole lot, but we sure do know which players to let hit the exit door, because in this scenario, they just beat their old quarterback, DJ Uiagalelei. Again, Dabo would never say that. It'd be a very mean thing to say, but he could be in a position. He could be in a position to told you so to death. So, depending on where you fall on that, that's a big hinge game. I got one in the SEC. I don't know if you guys realize, Georgia's got a really hard schedule this year, and it's being masked because Florida's got the hardest one this side of the NFL. Georgia's got one of the hardest schedules in college football this year. By the time they play Ole Miss in Week 11, Georgia will have already played Clemson, at Alabama, Auburn, at Texas, and Florida. That's just the games they already will have played. Then they play at Ole Miss before they turn around and play Tennessee the next week. So that is a far cry from what life in the good old SEC East used to serve up on the platter for Georgia. So this is a hinge game because, unlike Georgia, Ole Miss has got a very manageable schedule. I think if you were to tell me they beat Georgia, they're in the SEC championship game. That's what I would think. Because elsewhere on this schedule, they got back-to-back road games at South Carolina, at LSU, a bye week, then they play Oklahoma. They go 2 out of those 3 and then beat Georgia. They're in the SEC championship game. Like, to me, that's a no-brainer, unless just massive amounts of injuries pile up. But as for Georgia, what do they look like? They undefeated by the time they go to Oxford? They're a 1-loss team? Could they be a 2-loss team? Just gasping for air, knowing they have do or die, like back against the wall, no room for error, like any of those scenarios could be the case for Georgia here. It's not a typical Georgia schedule, guys. They could be a really, really good team this year and lose 2 regular season games just because they play a bunch of really, really good teams. So that's a big hinge game. And then, because I will not do one of these segments without talking about our dear friend, the Big 12, America's College Football Conference, Kansas State goes to West Virginia in Week 8. What is this doing on your list, Josh? Well, the simple answer is it's my list, so I have a constitutional right to make it however I want. But also, I think it's a Big 12 schedule, and it's a Big 12 special in terms of schedule. The Big 12, it's just pure demolition derby, so anyone can win the thing. There's no elite team. There's several really good teams. It's like a Tier 1's got 9 chairs at the table. So that means you just have this incredible conference slate. And unlike the SEC, where you circle Georgia versus Texas, there's not that kind of game in the Big 12, but there are a whole bunch of like Tier 2 type games. So here's the schedule dynamics. When Kansas State goes to West Virginia in Week 8, Kansas State will be in the second leg of a back-to-back road stretch that takes them to Boulder, Colorado, and then all the way over to Morgantown, West Virginia, back-to-back weeks. And by the way, they play Kansas the next week. No bye in between all that. So it's a really, really tough. It's one of the rare back-to-back road letdown / look-ahead rival sandwich spots in college football. One of the great, I am not even going to pretend to say that again, but it's one of those great situations. And then West Virginia, if that's not enough, West Virginia's in the middle of a 4-game stretch here where they go at Oklahoma State, then Iowa State. They play Kansas State, and then they go to Arizona. Their season will be made one way or another there. And you know what? Had they not had the bye before Oklahoma State, we could have added Kansas in there. They played Kansas before they played Oklahoma State a couple weeks later. So the Big 12's so beautiful. Why won't you guys just latch onto the Big 12 like me? I've got time to recruit some of you. I've got time. It's America's College Football Conference. It doesn't have to have a bunch of national title contenders, I promise. It's okay to watch good, solid 3-loss teams play to the bitter end in college football. It's okay. It used to be okay, and it still is okay.